Now, live from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, the Greenburgh Report, with Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now, on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and Greenburgh and Irvington are progressive communities. And last year, in the winter of 2019, I was reading an issue of The Roost produced by the Irvington Historical Society, and I read an article by Cathy, Sears and Sarah Cox about slavery in Irvington, and I was really surprised because I thought that slavery existed in the South, not in the North. So today we're going to talk during Black History Month about the role slavery had in the North. And my guest is Cathy Sears, who co-authored the article in The Roost, and she's giving a lecture on Sunday, February 23rd at noon at the Irvington Presbyterian Church, 25 North Broadway, Irvington, about slavery. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Paul. That will also be with my colleague, Sarah Cox, as well.
Right. Am I the only one who was surprised that there was slavery in Irvington?
I think everyone was. I think there's a common myth about slavery in the North. And in fact, there's a wonderful quote by Travis Bauman. He's a New York State historian. And he said there's a long-standing myth that it was only the North, that it was only in antebellums in the South. But capital punishment, torture, rape, beating, burnings at the stake, rape, all occurred in New York. Slavery's immoral no matter where it was, and slavery was the capital. New York was the capital of slavery for 200 years and quite predominant throughout the Hudson Valley.
That is so interesting. What got you interested in the subject of slavery in the village of Irvington?
Well, I think journalists and writers always want to know why. And so I think my street was named Buckout. And so I said, who is this person and what does he have to do with Irvington? And it went to my sense of place. And Sarah and I attended a lecture by a descendant of the Buckout Jewell family, and he said they had enslaved people. And I went, what? I said, I think of Irvington as Tiffany, Washington Irving, mansions. So Sarah's an educator at historic Hudson Valley, Sleepy Hollow. And so we jumped in. And then we found out that in Yonkers and also at Phillipsburg Manor, artists are creating sculptures to name the names of enslaved people and honor them. And that really, that's where our research began in earnest.
That is really fascinating. Now, there's a long-lost cemetery?
Yes, there is. It's and it's based on two published accounts. One is Scharf's late 19th century county history. Another is the Irvington Gazette in 1939. And so Scharf tells us about an Aunt Betty. It revealed a graveyard for enslaved people on Captain Jan Buckout's tenant farm, that my street. And he lived there from 1708 to the 1850s. And the Irvington Gazette reported that human skulls and bones were dug up from this almost entirely forgotten graveyard in 1895 when there was excavation for both the building of the Cosmopolitan Office Magazine building and the development of Barney Park housing development. And the authors tell us approximately where the house was and that there was a marker, an apple orchard planted later on top of it. And Westchester community historian Patrick Rafferty includes this graveyard, says this apparently was a slave cemetery. He includes it in his book of historical graveyards. And our analysis shows that the burial ground was located on South Buckout Street across from the Cosmopolitan Trent buildings. And the Irvington Gazette tells us that the burial ground was destroyed.
Do you know what happened to the remains?
We can only go with what it says, but Dr. Sarah Maska, she's the archaeologist with the Tarrytown Historical Society. She studied this type of subject, and she said that the remains of enslaved people were mere curiosities. In fact, they were exhibited in Tarrytown, and then they were thrown out. They were turned into landfill, and even today you will see throughout the news lawsuits over verified African-American cemeteries that are being threatened with development, being paved over. It's an enormous issue, very relevant today.
That is so interesting. We're going to have to take our first break, and this is really fascinating. I'm so pleased that you're bringing this history to light. And I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and right after this break, we're going to be hearing more about slavery in Irvington. Since I represent the entire Greenburgh, I guess slavery existed throughout.
1460 WVOX.
Now back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, my name's Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and I'm finding this interview really fascinating. Cathy Sears is doing a lot of research on slavery in Irvington, and she's going to be making a presentation on Sunday, February 23rd, Our Town and Slavery in Irvington, and that's going to be at what time? At noon?
At noon.
At noon at the Irvington Presbyterian Church, 25 North Broadway in Irvington. I'm sort of wondering, why was there slavery in Irvington?
It really comes down to supply, affordability, and acceptance. No matter the amorality of slavery, most of our founding families and their extended family in Greenburgh and their county opted in. And New York was the capital of slavery, as I said, for 200 years. And it was also financially compelling. A historian told me that in upstate, a one-time harvest of 6 acres of wheat meant you could buy a human being for life. We have another statistic on why it was compelling both for the manor lord and tenant farmers. You could try and get a freeholder, a person who was able to register vote and could buy property or what, to work, or which was hard. Or you, for 60 to 100 pounds, you could buy a human being for life. So it was completely financially compelling. Also, Irvington's part of the Phillipsburg Manor, which extends from Spuyten Duyvil up to Croton. And the Phillips family were actively involved in slavery and the piracy of enslaved people. And initially, they filled their upper mill site with slaves. They also, manor lords were also known to rent their slaves out to their tenant farmers. And you can see also in estate inventories that the tenant farmers also used enslaved people as collateral. Last thing, the lower Hudson Valley was part of the New York City colonial metro economy. Just like it is today, we're all part of that. And so it goes for the Phillipsburg Manor and their farms. They had a flourishing business furnishing food and other products for the city and the transatlantic slave trade. And slavery helped build and sustain these farms. Slavery was the economic engine that fueled this rapidly expanding economy in New York City, metro area, and all up and down the Hudson Valley.
Was there resistance when slavery was becoming controversial? Like, the Irvington residents, were they leading the effort to end slavery, or did they resist?
I really can't tell you specifically about Irvington. I can tell you that Westchester County, not once, but twice, voted definitely against Lincoln. They were, the New York City metro area was tied economically to the southern cotton plantations in the South, beginning through the Civil War. and we were one of the last states to join the Union cause. And a lot of people in our county were against secession. They were against secession, but they tolerated slavery. And it's not across the board. There were people certainly who didn't. And also I can tell you that there was resistance to emancipation very early on, especially in the Hudson Valley with the Dutch farmers. They and their supporters actually prevented for 14 years the very first initiation in 1799 about gradual emancipation. They delayed that. They thwarted it. And our county actually voted, against emancipation initially. There was resistance. That's
really interesting. I'm sort of wondering how you do your research.
Well, Sarah Cox, I have to add that my colleague Sarah Cox, she's been an educator for 20 years at Phillipsburg Manor and is quite experienced in the history of slavery. So my home is ground zero. My office is full of maps, 4 bins of research, and I have a huge database, and Sarah and I have worked off and on for 4 years. So we spend a lot of time in the archives. There's a lot of data online. We also have relied on the CUNY Slavery Index, which is continually being updated. It's through the John J. Justice Center. It's quite remarkable. But even if you look at the genealogy, a lot is online, or these old typed papers can be contradictory. And there's a lot of fact-checking. And I found a very relevant quote by the authors in 1894 on the souvenirs of the Revolutionary Soldiers Monument dedication. That's where there's a lot of research. And they were so confused by the family names because everyone named their son, their brother, their uncle, their father, the very same name. So teasing it out. So we've looked at deeds. That's been very helpful. And Chet Kerr in our community has been very helpful in helping tease that out. But it's fascinating, hard work, complicated, but it's getting a little bit easier.
There's a lot of people in Irvington whose families lived in Irvington for generations. Are there any current residents of Irvington who remember their parents or grandparents talking about slavery?
I think I've spoken to some people who remember minstrel shows and things like that. Now, when I moved here, the very last Buckout moved out of town when he won the lottery. But what I can tell you is that, 3 of our 4 streets are named for, founding families, and that they also enslaved people. A 4th person for a street name. The person listed in the census could likely have been serving servitude and bondage, part of gradual emancipation.
So that was the Dutchers, the Buckhouse, Odell's, and Peter Bunt?
No, not Peter Bunt or Ferris. No, there may have been some family history of slavery, but no, they did not. And along with the Buckout Eckers and Dutchers, there were also the Odells, Van Tassels, and Ruckwitz, and very active in their community. They were true patriots in the Revolutionary War, and we have some reports of enslaved people who stayed on their property and actually saved their property during the fall of White Plains, when British and their sympathizers came in and wrecked the general area. But contrary to current view, our founding families did not break ground alone.
Great. So we have to take a break in a couple of seconds, and we'll be right back talking with Cathy Sears about slavery in Irvington. And this is an appropriate time because this is Black History Month, and it's important for Westchester residents to recognize the history of our county.
Now back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner, and I'm so glad that the commercials are over for this segment because I'm so interested in this topic. My guest is Cathy Sears, and it's really a fascinating discussion because I bet you most people have no clue that our communities were in the forefront of slavery, and it's really relatively recent. It's less. It's in the 1800s, and I'm sort of wondering. There's so many people who had slaves, and we celebrate their names on street signs. What are we going to do to recognize the slaves?
Well, I think just to set it up, I think I'm reminded of the Hamilton song, like "Who Tells Your Story," and our county histories. Newspaper articles, books, famous authors. It's told from white male perspective. The African American voice was not heard nor acknowledged, so the stories were not told nor known. So what I wanted to tell you is Sarah and I, Sarah is the chair of Recognized Enslaved Africans in Irvington Committee. I was co-chair with her, and I've resigned to work on my book. But anyway, the group is a consortium of like the Inclusion Diversity Committee, the Irvington Historical Society, the Department of Education, the Revolutionary War Patriot group, a wide group. And so the focus has been to, like we saw, like Vinnie Bagwell creating the naming and honoring enslaved people with the African Enslaved Ring Garden that's going to open in the spring in Yonkers, and also the named people at Phillipsburg Manor. We wanted to honor them with public art in Irvington. And so the committee, and with Sarah as the chair, are going to go to the Village Board of Trustees on May 14th with a proposal. And it's public art and a plaque by noted sculptor Vinnie Bagwell, who, by the way, was just in the news for her remarkable sculpture of Harriet Tubman. And we hope that along with the plaque about a second plaque about the enslaved burial ground, that we will become a destination for the African American Heritage Trail and also a destination for reflection and education. And we're also going to be working with, Sarah's group is going to be working with the Department of Education too.
Right, and maybe the schools could get involved in this also.
Absolutely. Schools. And I just want to say, too, that the name of our lecture has relevance. It's like Our Town in Slavery. Purposely wrote that because our town is your town, and that's like the name of my book. And it goes toward that you can replace our town in slavery, Irvington, New York, with any town here. And so it goes toward helping people uncover their history and understand that legacy of slavery and the impact on the community.
And I bet you people, if they realize that they're in downtown Irvington walking on an old cemetery that was redeveloped and the remains were destroyed, I think people would be really upset about that.
Yes, it was. We held, I think, on Celebrate Irvington Day a year or so ago, we did a little walk and stopped there and talked about it. It was very emotionally touching with the diverse group of people, incredibly touching and moving. And we did this lecture also back in June, and where we named these 15 people. And it's emotional. It strikes people from different directions and their own perspectives.
It would be interesting if there'd be a sign or a plaque at the former cemetery.
Yes, that's what's intended.
So you would put a
plaque. Yeah, yes.
That's a great idea. Have you worked Phillipsburg Manor and the New York Times? They created a website to accurately reflect the role of 23 enslaved Africans, and the Times had the 1619 initiative. Have you worked with them at all?
with Phillipsburg Manor, with Historic Hudson Valley, we consulted with their historian, Michael Lord, and one of their archivists on our own research, and they referred us on to additional historians. It was very extremely helpful, but it had nothing to do with their initiative. Sarah, however, has been an educator there for 20 years. She's very well schooled in their whole program. They have a remarkable interactive documentary on it. And
right. In terms of the Rivertown's Episcopal Parish's action on inclusion and race, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
About repair, Sarah actually went to a lecture at the Irvington Episcopal Church, and I know that the committee in Irvington is going to be reaching out to them and hoping to collaborate with them in the future. We spoke to the minister there and shared something about our lecture.
Are you collaborating with like some of the African American churches, and is a committee like open to anyone who wants to get involved and participate?
Absolutely. We've been Judith Belleville. We've town clerk. She helped establish the 400 history, which is based on 1619. We've been talking with her committee and liaisoning with them. There's a lot of work to do, but I've spoken to several people on that committee and recommended they become part of this larger consortium. There's so much work to do and to collaborate.
I wonder if people are sort of if there's a move to just whitewash, history, and almost are there people who are resisting giving people information about the role Irvington had?
I tell you, it's really throughout the United States, but there was an article about Washington Post about Jefferson's home, which they feature Sally Hemings' little home, and a woman was walking through going, can't we just talk about the garden? And same thing with Monroe, President Monroe's home. It's like, why do we have to talk about slavery? And I think if you don't know that history and you don't understand the legacy, and that's a crucial part of this, is understanding the legacy. For example, it's sort of this so what? So what does it have to do with me? You have to tell people about the impact of slavery, and then Reconstruction, Jim Crow, restrictive clauses, redlining, all those impacted who we are, where we live, and how we live.
When did slavery end in Irvington?
We are still teasing part of that. I can say that the named people, so at least 1708, we know it began much earlier, into the 1825. And there are, I've followed some of the families also in Greenburgh, and it is extended beyond that, and also into servitude and bondage. You can actually find African American people with the same last names of our founding families. So it goes on. The work isn't complete on that.
So would you think it was more like the early 1800s where it ended, like 1820, 1830, or later?
I think, we cite in our lecture Vivian Kruger's research, and when she talked about gradual emancipation, the effects of it, because children of enslaved women, if you're born after July something in 1827, 1799, whatever, you had to serve a term of 25, 28 years of bondage. And those could be delayed through wills, your master, the people who owned people. They could delay those through a variety of ways. So she says that it really took until mid-1870s for free black children to be born to free black parents in New York. And that goes for Westchester County, 1870. And then, of course, then you see Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, restrictive clauses, redlining, all these things.
So really New York resisted it just like the South?
Yes. We were incredibly tied economically from the very beginning of 1826 when the first ship came in, and remained so through the beginning of the Civil War. In fact, there were actions against local abolitionists after the Civil War, beating them up and threatening to burn their home down after the Civil War. And of course, then there's the histories written from a single perspective and excluding the African Americans.
We have to take another break. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor, interviewing Cathy Sears, and she's giving a lecture February 23rd, Our Town and Slavery in Irvington, at noon at the Irvington Presbyterian Church, 25 North Broadway in Irvington. So we'll be right back. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor.
WVOX. Now back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and we're talking with Cathy Sears, and she is giving a lecture on Our Town and Slavery, Irvington, New York. And the lecture is going to be Sunday, February 23rd at noon at the Irvington Presbyterian Church, 25 North Broadway, Irvington. And if you think that our community is so progressive now and was always progressive, you're wrong, because it wasn't always progressive. We were in the forefront of slavery, just like other places in the country. And after slavery, there was also some inappropriate things they did. For example, the Jim Crow laws and redlining. Can you tell us a little bit about Irvington's experience?
I can speak to the larger issue in our county. I think, and also in Greenburgh, as far as the Jim Crow laws, I mean, very quickly, people were marginalized. They were told whether they, going back into slavery a little bit, but it's who could own property. There were loans that took advantage of African American communities, and but it sidelined people into specific communities, and that had to do with redlining and restrictive clauses. There's a remarkable book. I wish I could remember the name, but it truly, truly woke me. And it's about how federal, state, local, churches even would create restrictive clauses. And for example, I'm speaking about the larger community, would insert a clause that said an integrated community or a neighborhood that wanted to sell to an African-American family. Well, you couldn't, because they had sort of this buffer zone there. So churches were involved, state and local governments. And I know, and we know from Madam C.J. Walker that she had to sort of slip in with a sleight of hand, sort of with slight transfer of the deed in order to move into Irvington. She was thwarted in a lot of Westchester County in trying to move in.
Yeah, I was sort of curious. How did she manage to, she wasn't welcomed with open arms? No matter how famous she was. And so I believe there was a deed transfer, maybe something to do with NAACP. Chet Kerr of the Historical Society really knows this history, but but she built this magnificent mansion. And so if you look at the news reports of that time, they're going, well, it's really beautiful, but it still reflects the time of, well, we're worried about this African-American person. What is she going to do with this mansion?
and sort of disrespectful sort of stereotypes at that time. And we also know from Chet Kerr's research that people, some very well-established famous names who owned major mansions in Irvington popped up and bought a huge chunk of land and said, put a restrictive clause on that.
Would you know if after she moved in, was she welcomed ever? Was she ever embraced by the Irvington community, later on after she was here?
Do you know, I can't tell you. Barrett Seaman of the Irvington Historical Society is writing actually a journal article about Madam C.G. Walker, and he could better address that issue. But I have looked at the newspapers, and if you even, just in general, if you look at newspapers in the early 1920s, they have these old stories of old, stereotypes and mammies and things. It's really so racially offline.
And I guess it's just typical of the times. Everybody thinks that people are people, I guess, and the Irvington community wasn't progressive, but the rest of the country wasn't really that progressive. So,
nor New York, nor our county, especially New York.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about the Roost? You published your article in the winter 2019 issue of the Roost.
Yes, and so we name, I think there are 14 people named in there. We specifically we sort of focus in on the Requas and the Buckout family. We reviewed their estate inventories and really used their wills and documents to focus in on the enslaved people. So we talk about the enslaved people who were on the estate auction of Jan Buckout. And we talk about the Requas, who at one time had 10 enslaved people in the northernmost Montefiore is located, had 10 enslaved people, and we show that even children were. Requas sold he sold a young boy by the name of David, and then his estate, several years later, sold 4 more children. It's incredibly poignant. You can look on this estate inventory, and it reveals both the good and bad. It tells you how they lived, but it also tells you that how they were considered property, like that one child was the equivalent of 8 cows. And a little girl, Hannah, was the equivalent of a certain amount of chickens and geese. It really puts a real lens in perspective, a very direct view into our history and our ancestors.
And you mentioned earlier on that there were, it wasn't just that people were treated as property, but they were raped, they were tortured.
Yes, Travis Bauman, who gave a lecture, he has studied the mid and upper Hudson Valley. He's an expert New York historian, and he really talked about that. And there, you can look at slave ads, runaway ads. There's myriad documents. New York Historical Society notes that if you were to go to the enslaved African burial ground, they really I think it was Emory University who examined some of the exhumed bones, show the impact of slavery on the people who were enslaved, the 15,000 people at least who were buried down there. We can also tell you that in New York, public whipping was the longest and longest legal punishment in New York, and we have tracked it Rye, 1739, 1749, even to 1827.
I know Hamilton's, I think, son lived in Irvington.
Yes, one of his children.
I wonder if they had slaves. I'm just thinking, because I did watch the show Hamilton.
I don't believe so, but I actually can't answer that. His estate, it was one of the large estates that was built later on, so it was a later time period.
We just have less than a minute left, and I'm sort of wondering if there was like an anti-slavery movement that was very active in Irvington, and if you've highlighted those individuals.
Chet Kerr has done some research on one of the large estate owners during the mid-1800s, the large estate homes, some of which we still have. And I think it was Maccabee, and he and a colleague had a newspaper, and he and his colleague publicly stood up against the draft riots, and they took a very public hit about their stance and standing up and saying this is wrong. And there's a really important quote about them in that regard.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're running out of time, and I wanted to thank you very, very much for joining us. My guest has been Cathy Sears, and we talked about Irvington and its role with slavery. And please attend her lecture.
And Sarah Cox.
With Sarah Cox, Our Town and Slavery, on Sunday, February 23rd at noon at the Irvington Presbyterian Church, 25 North Broadway in Irvington. Do you know if they're going to be filming that? Yeah.
No.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and I'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.